and I'm excited to introduce our next reader. Julia Borcherts is a co-founder of Reading Under the Influence and the Chicago Way Lit series, a fiction writing instructor at Columbia College, Chicago, a theater columnist for Red Eye, and a frequent contributor to Time Out Chicago and the Windy City Times. She's been featured reader at Victory Gardens' Fresh Squeeze series, Second Story, the Windy City Story Slam, This Much Is True, Two with Water, the Revolutions Reading Series, Two Cookie Minimum, the Museum of Contemporary Art, Women and Children First Bookstore, the Criminal Press Anti-Gala, and many other events and venues. And we're so excited to have Julia here with us now. Please welcome Julia.
Hello. The story is called My Baby, the Remix. I was 18 years old and 8 months pregnant when Kenny tied me to the bed for the first and last time. It was May of 1981, and we were living in Miami, and Bob Marley had landed there a few days before. He was heading home to die, but he had waited too long. The cancer had spread into his brain, and he was having seizures. So they canceled his connecting flight to Jamaica and took him straight to Cedars of Lebanon Hospital. My boyfriend Kenny was a punk musician, if such a thing is not an oxymoron. But for the entire time that I lived with him, which was less than a year, he'd get up every morning, light a joint to calm his cocaine nerves, and put the Exodus album on the stereo, and I'd wake up to the seductive intro from Natural Mystic and the smell of weed. When we heard from our landlord, Lorenzo, a gay Cuban nurse with an Elvis pompadour who worked in the cancer ward at Cedars of Lebanon, that Rita Marley had brought the kids to Miami for what was turning out to be a death watch, Kenny went out and shoplifted Marley's final studio album, Uprising, and began playing it day and night along with the rest of the city. We'd gone to bed that night, listening to the last track, Redemption Song, and somewhere around the time that Marley started crooning, "Emancipate yourself from mental slavery," Kenny got a glint in his eye at the word slavery. He stopped kissing my 40-inch belly and pushed himself up on one elbow, stabbing me in the eye with his stiff green Travis Bickle mohawk. I yelped and smacked him, and he grabbed both my wrists and pushed them back to the posts on our lopsided mahogany bed. "You've been a very bad girl," he said, as he ripped the top sheet off the mattress and tied up my left wrist. "Get off me! I'm not in the mood for this," I yelled, trying to twist my beached whale self away from him. "Baby, come on, it's been 3 weeks," he said, and he grabbed his belt off the floor and strapped my other wrist down too. I was still screaming at him when he lost interest and left, probably to go find somebody else to have sex with. Sure, I was angry and hurt, but when I went into labor, it suddenly became a crisis. There I was, alone, in this weird little stucco coach house, amniotic fluid leaking down my legs, cramps shooting up my back, screaming and hoping that either Kenny or Lorenzo would hurry up and get home and rescue me. The album was set to repeat, so I kept track of the hours by the number of times I heard Redemption Song, which was 5. As luck would have it, Lorenzo got home first, which is how I ended up getting hauled off to Cedars of Lebanon too, to have my baby on the same day that Bob Marley died. But wait, I'm getting ahead of myself here. Rewind. You might be wondering how a girl like me ended up at age 18 in a mess like this, stuck in Miami in the early 80s. Later, Miami Vice made it trendy and people started calling it South Beach and acting like it had been some undiscovered hotspot. But back when I lived there, everyone called it God's waiting room because it was mostly old people who had come there to die. Them and the 125,000 Mariel boatlift refugees and the cocaine traffickers, and don't think they didn't all cross paths. Close your eyes and imagine old ladies in comfort shoes, smuggling coke in their purses and laundering a few grand a week at the bank. New Cuban immigrants are driving luxury cars with $1 million stashed in the trunk. Cops are killing dealers and stealing their contraband. There's a police brutality murder at the Liberty City housing projects that sparks a riot all over the city. Police cars torched, vehicles burning with victims inside, black plumes of smoke visible from 15 miles away. The National Guard has to come in. In 1981, Miami had the highest murder rate in the country. The national economy had gone to shit, but people paid cash for Rolls Royces all over Dade County. I ended up there because my parents split up when I was 14, and my dad left New Jersey to find himself at a trailer park commune outside of Fort Lauderdale. When I was 15, my mom met a new guy and sent me to go live with my dad. But his commune turned out to be a nudist colony. They let me wear clothes, but still, it was weird waving hello to middle-aged joggers with droopy testicles while I walked to school. On my 16th birthday, I went into Miami and got myself a job at a laundromat on 13th Street called Suds Your Duds, which is where I met my landlord, Lorenzo. He was hand-washing a red sequin blouse, and I was mopping up water around an overloaded big boy machine when he noticed how beat down my feet looked in my flip-flops. "Chica, you got a saucy minx in you somewhere," he said, scrubbing at a stain. "But if anyone's going to see her, you need to take those hooves and get them a pedicure." "But I don't want to be a saucy minx," I argued. He dropped the blouse, and his waxed eyebrows shot halfway up to his forelock. "What's wrong with you?" he demanded, grabbing my elbows. "Everyone, even my grandmother, wants to look sexy." "Not that it's any of your business," I told him, ramming the mop into his platform shoes. "But my dad's a nudist, and until I can make enough money to move out, I don't want things to get too awkward around his friends." If you've ever hung out with a drag queen, you know that they're not too easily shocked, right? Well, that was the one and only time I've seen Lorenzo speechless. But he recovered, rinsed out his blouse, and followed me around while I folded the drop-off laundry and cleaned the lint out of the dryer vents. By the time his nurse's uniforms had dried, we'd become friends, and he came back the next day and offered me the second bedroom in his coach house down the street by Flamingo Park. I moved in that week. I was too young for the clubs, so Lorenzo would take me to underground dance parties in dilapidated hotels and empty storefronts, with everyone from gays to punks to drug dealers, and a few newly rich bankers and hotshot lawyers and slumming socialites. You'd walk in and the sand fleas bit your ankles, and the decrepit bathrooms would be swarming with palmetto bugs, giant flying cockroaches. But there'd be a rolling dance floor with kaleidoscopic lights coming in at crazy angles, a mirrored disco ball nailed to a rafter, and a huge makeshift sound system, blaring Eurodisco, Latin freestyle, dance hall, George Clinton and Grace Jones, and of course Bob Marley, always Exodus or Could You Be Loved. The high rollers brought champagne and people smoked weed on the dance floor because if they lit up outside, the place would get raided. Everywhere you looked, there was coke and amyl nitrate poppers and MDA, which is the closest thing they had back then to a hit of X. Of course, half of these people would be dead of AIDS before 5 years were up, but we didn't know about that yet. So everyone smoked and snorted and danced and shoved poppers up each other's noses while they fucked in dark corners. I was a kid who worked in a laundromat, so everyone mostly ignored me. But I loved it anyway, and I went with Lorenzo every night. So, since I was underage and living in the middle of a Miami snowstorm, you might say that my judgment was a bit impaired the night I met Kenny. He was 20 years old and tall and thin, and he wore a lot of leather, which made him look like Sid Vicious, except that his mohawk was green and he dyed it with Sears exterior house paint. He joined me in a corner one night a few months after my 17th birthday when I was dancing alone to Exodus, and when the song ended, he offered me a rail. He licked the residue out of my nostril, and I thought it was the sexiest thing ever. He came home with Lorenzo and me that night and mostly just never left, although he did run off with various coke whores sometimes while I was working at Suds Your Duds. I was ready to leave him, in fact, when I realized I was pregnant, but by then I just didn't want to be alone. Still, he could be sweet when he wasn't overwrought from too much blow. He massaged my feet when they started to swell, and as the time got closer for the baby to be born, he had me re-pierce his ears, putting a yellow duck diaper pin in his right ear and my failed IUD in his left. Okay, enough backstory. Fast forward to me on that bed. My savior, Lorenzo, has just arrived. Lorenzo untied me, stuck his hand up my crotch, and told me that I was only dilated 2 centimeters and therefore had a good 12 hours left. He slapped on a Kotex to soak up the amniotic fluid, helped me pack a bag, and left a note for Kenny, who didn't show up until after I'd come home from the hospital anyway. Then we got in his ancient Cadillac and floored it to Cedars of Lebanon. Lorenzo checked me into a labor room and then left me to my cramps while he went off to see how the Marleys were doing. I was playing solitaire with a deck of cards I'd found and trying to figure out how I'd get even with Kenny when Lorenzo came charging back in with a wheelchair. "Get in," he yelped, yanking me up by the arm, his pompadour shivering. "I told the Marleys that my teenage, unwed, pregnant sister was having a baby down on the next floor, and they said I could bring you by for a blessing." What I really wanted was a voodoo curse to make Kenny's dick fall off. But when I suggested it, Lorenzo just put his hands on his hips and snarled, "Do you want the blessing or not, bitch?" And a contraction hit, so I just fell into the wheelchair. He took me up the elevator to the cancer floor, past two Rastafarian bodyguards, who got up from folding chairs to open the door to Marley's room as Lorenzo wheeled me up. You could smoke in hospitals back then, so despite the fact that we were in a cancer ward, everyone had lit up cigarettes to cover the smell of the ganja. The window was open, but there was still a bluish-gray haze hanging over the room, and I got lightheaded and started coughing when Lorenzo pushed me in and closed the door behind us. "Oh, please, you ungrateful heifer," Lorenzo hissed. "Don't act like you weren't high all the time the first few months you were pregnant." "But I didn't know I was pregnant," I started, but he shoved his hand over my mouth as a pain shot up my spine, so I shut up. There were at least a dozen people in that room, all crying softly. A large boombox took up half the window on the far wall, and Waiting in Vain was playing so low I could barely hear it. But I knew the lyrics, and when I heard the part about how, "In life, you know, there's a lot of grief, but your love is my relief," it made me think about Kenny, and I started to cry too. But then the crowd of people in the middle of the room parted, and I could see Bob Marley lying on the bed. I'd been expecting the man that you see on the cover of that live album from 1975, dreadlocks flying, intense vitality with a quick smile. But on his last day, he wasn't like that. He was a small man, maybe just my height, and his dreads had fallen out from a last-ditch effort with chemo. And he was so scrawny that he looked 106 instead of just 36. But when he opened his eyes, a weak smile appeared, and I got a flash of his dimples. "He likes the babies," said a diminutive, dark woman in a brightly colored knitted tam, who I later realized was his wife, Rita. "He feels the energy from you." And I knew then that I wasn't as worthless as Kenny had made me feel. He stretched out his hand, and when I took it, he reached up and put it on my belly. I felt a jolt, which may have just been the baby kicking, but which Lorenzo later swore was a blessing. His hand dropped, and I looked up at Lorenzo, who turned my chair around. By the time we hit the elevator, I knew I was done with Kenny. Bob Marley died the next morning, which is when my daughter was born. People asked me later why I didn't name her Marley, or at least Roberta. I considered it, but it seemed too dorky and pretentious even for me. As a mark of respect, I did put her to bed every night with Waiting in Vain for a lullaby, but other than that, we didn't conjure up the spirit of Bob Marley in the house that much. To be honest, if I ever hear a redemption song again, it will be too soon.
Thank you very much, Julia. Even my wife who hates reggae loved this story. So.